It's April 26, 2016, here in London, England. I'm Alan Kane, and this morning I'm talking to Christopher Curry, one of the pioneers of the UK's homegrown microcomputer industry. This interview will come in two parts. The first, a discussion of Christopher's career, and second, his background, influences and views on the information technology business. Christopher, you started your career, I think, in Pi, the electronics company. What drove you to take a job there?
Well, actually, I had to get a job somewhere. I decided not to go to university because I thought the Diploma of Technology, which with its sandwich courses, appealed more to me. So I had to get a job somewhere. Pi was the most important electronics company in the area. So I started what was called a student apprenticeship there. And that was a quite extraordinary experience.
What kind of work were you doing?
Well, as a student apprentice, the first thing you have to do is learn to solder and work on the production line. A production line was about 500 women with very bouffant hair in those days, and about 4 chaps like me doing these courses. So we were very well outnumbered, and it was a quite extraordinary experience.
So this was education as well as work?
I learnt how to solder very well indeed. I wrapped the wires, and this is before printed circuit boards existed. You had tags, and you wrapped the wire round through the hole, snipped it off at exactly the right point, and put a blob of solder over it. That's how Pi of Cambridge radio sets were made, like that.
So this was for radio?
Yeah, what they did at Pi Telecom was they made car radio systems for the police forces of the world. I mean, they were probably the principal supplier in the world.
But you weren't there very long. You left after a few months to join the Royal Radar establishment. Why was that?
Well, after I learned to solder, I was put on electrical testing, which meant a vast sack of relays would arrive on one side of you, and you plonk them in a slot, click a button and read the resistance and put it in there. And after a few months of this, I thought, I don't think I can go on doing this. So I saw a job advertised at the Royal Radar establishment as a lab technician, and I could do my DipTech course at the Royal College of Radar. So off I went from Bedford Station to, when it existed, to Malvern, lovely place, and started living in the Geraldine Staff Club, which was the place where everybody lived. It was like a boarding school. It was an extraordinary establishment. And everywhere you looked were radar dishes going up and down and round and round. And in that place they did everything. Absolute. It was a Aladdin's cave of wonderful scientific things. Beautiful place, marvellous.
At this time, were you using integrated circuits in any of this work?
Nope.
So that was yet to come?
Yeah, it was yet to come. Yeah. There were things like the nose cone of TSR2 sat in the lab next to me. And, you know, there's just wonderful. The radar which TSR2 had in it was, of course, the most advanced radar in the world. I was working on superconductivity, actually. No, we made superconducting junctions. I used to sputter bits of aluminium onto glass, put a milliamp down one bit and stop 10 amps travelling the other way, which was magic.
Indeed.
And great fun. Marvellous place.
Again, you stayed there a comparatively short time,
yeah,
and then moved on to the ITT laboratories of W.G. Grace.
Oh yes.
What was that all about?
Well, I had a bit of a dust up I had a warning at the Royal Radar establishment. I'd been skiving my college afternoons and filling in the register as if I'd been there, which a lot of us did, by the way. But this was a serious offence. And when they also found that to travel to the Cavern Club once from Malvern in a only just working Morris 8, we had used a Winchester bottle of ethanol absolute to put in the petrol tank. which had come from stores. I mean, and this is again something that a lot of people did there. The stores, you could get anything. And if you worked there and you'd signed the Official Secrets Act, they expected absolute decorum. I'm afraid I wasn't very good. They found that I'd had a Winchester bottle and got to Liverpool on it. Missed the Beatles, but we went to the cavern. So I had a warning that says if you stay you will face disciplinary procedure. You have a chance to leave and you will not have a stain on your record. So I chose to leave. Had to get a job, W.R. Grace. What did we do there? They blew bubbles to make cling film. And I really didn't do very much, except I used to take part in taste testing. Well, I was a lab technician. You do what lab technicians do. But taste testing was the best bit because they were replacing cork seals in bottles. So you had a tonic water to try and see which one tasted nice or closest to the reference. And then weekly competitions, who got it right. But that's the only thing I really remember about it, because that was pretty tedious too. So when I saw an advertisement, and I'm probably jumping your gun here, from Sinclair Radionics,
that was in 1966 you joined Sinclair. What was Sinclair advertising for?
Engineers. He'd just moved to Cambridge, and he wanted engineers. He was a very loose term. It didn't say with any particular experience. My experience was building things with valves, and I had actually bought one of Clive Sinclair's early products, an X10 PWM amplifier, which never worked very well, but anyway, so I knew his products, and I liked building electronic things, so that's where I went, and that's when the fun started.
Well, what did Sinclair put you on when you joined?
Little radios, amplifiers, the Matchbox radio, Micromatic. I developed that. He used to come in and say, try this, try this, try this, and then disappear, and you'd have to build it and fiddle with resistor values and capacitance values and look at ways of making it work a bit better, wind the coils on the ferrite rods, and then lay the thing out and squeeze it in a box with a battery.
What was it like working for Sinclair?
Well, it was very hectic. Clive was a very irascible person who was always charging up and down, shouting and throwing his slider all around. But it was great fun, and we worked till late at night every night, and then usually I'd go off to the pub at about 8 o'clock with him, and he'd go home afterwards, and I'd go home afterwards. But there was always a new project, a new product to be developed, and you'd take it from the idea that usually Clive came up with, that he wanted to do this, and you'd take it right the way through, lay the printed circuit board out, test the components, put it all together in a kit suitable for selling and mail order, and book, everything from the packaging. He always did the advertising.
He did the advertising?
He always did the advertising.
But you were involved, I think, in the development of the Sinclair Executive Calculator.
One New Year's Eve party, which was one of Clive's annual events, the New Year's Eve party, which were usually awful drunken scenes and fights and things like that. Not with Clive, I should say. Perish the thought. I had done my share of drinking and socialising, and I knew that I had to get on a plane early that next morning to America, to Texas, in fact, to go and collect the first samples of a chip called the TMS 1802, which was the first single-chip calculator that TI had developed. Clive had arranged this, and I was sent off to get it, with the worst hangover on God's earth and in the most terrible condition. I got there. We got 3 chips, and a chip was more or less a new thing in those days. But 3 chips, and 2 others went to Japan. So we got 3 out of the 5 samples that they originally sent out of TI. And my job when I got back was to build a prototype around this chip. We didn't have keyboards or anything to work with, so we had to build bits of wire with flexible bits of tin on them to make a keyboard. And eventually, and a clock, and eventually after a couple of days, the most amazing moment was we had an LED display, and seeing, because we got the clock at the wrong speed, seeing, pressing a key, and a whole lot of flutterings went across the screen, and then a number appeared eventually in 7-segment form. Times button, a lot of fluttering, and then another number, and the result. We always did 22/7 was the test. Pi, I'm sorry. And when the figure came up on the screen, I think everybody gathered round and cheered. It was magic. This was magic.
How many decimal points?
3.1428571. I think that was 8 digits on the display.
Okay. So how revolutionary was a pocket calculator at that time?
There were no others. That was the only one. I think there was a one called Rapidman 800 from the States, but it was a great big lumpy green thing. And what Clive always did was to try and make things look really sleek. So the case was designed to be very much a pocket, almost a fashion accoutrement or something that the wealthier businessman could show off with. And in fact, we did supply one of the very early ones. We supplied to Lord Rothschild in Cambridge, and there's quite a story. I don't know whether it's appropriate for this, but the story was that
let's hear it.
We had squeezed every last bit of power out of these 3 little button cells. Too much, in fact, because if you take too much drain out of them, they degas. He was in a board meeting, Lord Rothschild in a board meeting, and one of the batteries exploded in his pocket, and he thought he'd had a heart attack, and they called ambulances and things like that. He hadn't had a heart attack. It was the bloody executive going off bang in his pocket. He was very reasonable about it. I took him round a replacement a few days later. But I think we changed the circuit after that, so we didn't have this tendency for the other batteries to charge the one that went flat first. But it was £79. It cost us £11 to make, and we sold them. We couldn't make them fast enough.
Yes. And you were still at this stage doing the engineering as opposed to managing, or
there were no managers. Clive ran everybody, but everybody had responsibility from ordering the components right through to getting the production made. So each project was somebody's end-to-end task, which was nice because you learnt every part of it, and you could watch Clive to learn about how the advertising and the marketing was done.
That was his particular skill, advertising and marketing.
Well, it's the bit
concept advertising and marketing.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Oh, but he's also. He started off doing circuit design. He published a little book called Bernard's Radio Books, if you remember those, which were 22 tested circuits. And 2 or 3 transistors doing something or other. So he's a circuit designer. Transistors were quite new things then.
Indeed. But by 1976, the National Enterprise Board, which was an agency of the Labour government set up to encourage investment in British business, took a share in Sinclair. What was all that about?
I think it was a cash flow problem, and there'd been a grant which had horrible strings with it. So when it didn't achieve, this was, I think, more to do with the television, the microvision, which was costing money and had after the launch had to undergo a complete redesign, different kind of tube. Well, that was one of the things I worked on. We worked 5 days before the radio show where we had to show this, building the damn things, and I remember winding frame coils, the 400 turns of 40 SWG wire had to be done in a very short space of time to get the things working. We got them working, stood beside them correcting the frame hold every 2 minutes, but they worked. But the design was never going to be a mass production one, so it moved to another one, moved to an electrostatic display screen. But gradually the time went by and the costs went up, and I think that was when the NEB, it was a slightly less friendly organisation than it could have been. It definitely had a view to nationalising things if it had a chance. And Clive Sinclair Radionics was getting to the stage where the NEB was taking too many decisions. Clive didn't like it at all, and then he was told he'd got to reduce staff costs. And so I talked to him, we agreed to set up a little outfit on the side that would use up some of the surplus chips that we had for the calculators.
Yes, we'll come to this in a second, but the executive calculator was very successful.
Yes.
The Blackwatch and the television had problems.
The television, yes, the television never really got to volume production. The Blackwatch did, but it had terrible reliability problems. It was very smart, but it didn't work very well.
What sort of lessons do you think are to be learned from that experience?
I don't think I think the Blackwatch gave Sinclair Radionics a rather bad name. It didn't stop people buying the product, as we well know from what happened later, but it was an expensive error, and it was often because Clive had a tremendous tendency to go for the lowest possible cost of assembly. So if you could save a transistor that was only 5p, he would, even if it meant that something might not work quite as well. Yeah, I suppose spoiling ships and things like that comes to mind, but that's the only lesson I'd say. I mean, the Blackwatch looked good. I personally never liked digital watches, so I never really wore one. I had a Hamilton for a while, but I didn't like the look of them. Didn't like having to press them to see what the time was.
Yes, I mean, just for the record, the Blackwatch was a black plastic watch with which you pressed a button to see the time, which came up on a red LED display.
Yes, which was under a darkened filter, so the whole of the surface of the watch looked completely black until you pressed it, and then it lit through. It was impressive, but sometimes you press very hard as well.
And you could build it as a kit?
I don't know. You couldn't. The thing you could build as a kit was a thing that was rather like it, which was the first product that we built in what was briefly called Sinclair Instrument. That was I'm glad I've got the ring off on this. That was a wrist calculator.
Ah, yes.
Based on the C550 from General Instrument, and a load of buttons. It was roughly the same size as the Blackwatch, a bit bulkier. Had 8 little mercury cells, as they were then. And we sold lots of kits in America. I don't know whether I'm leaping ahead, but the American part of Sinclair Radionics was not subject to the NEB's constraints, so we tried to build up as much sales in the US, and certainly sold something like 100,000 of those little watches over there. I don't know how many came back. People are very forgiving with kits. We had kits that people built with solder paste instead of soldering irons, and most of the time we'd repair them for them. But kits were a good way of concealing what could have been perhaps a slightly more professional design in the first place.
Okay.
Beta testing in the field.
Which the computer industry has specialised in.
I'm afraid so.
From
But then,
year zero.
but then it has to, because of the software side of things, I
Indeed.
suppose.
Was, I mean, software presumably wasn't.
Software
much in
had
evidence in
started.
Singapore at
Yes,
this
it
time.
had started because the programmable calculator, one of the
Yes.
Cambridge programmable, wasn't software. It was programmable in a crude way, but to make it programmable, straightforward software had been done for it by one of our number called Nigel Searle, who was our specialist in doing it.
Anyway, tell me about the spin-off, the birth of Science of Cambridge.
Well, it was first, the watch was done under the name Sinclair Instrument, and it was part owned by Clive and me. He had the majority. The watch was based on surplus stock. The watch calculator was based on surplus stock. But later on we were trying to use one of the programmable calculator chips to make something like a programmable microcomputer.
Whose idea would that have been to build a
I wanted to do it. I'd been out to the States a couple of times, picked up a magazine called, I think it might have been Wired or something like that. Yeah. And there was somebody advertising, I think they were called something like Altair, a computer in a book. And they were selling a computer in a folder which had a printed circuit board, some packets of components and some instructions, a bit like the MK14, but in a book, because they didn't pay purchase tax on it if it was a book. Well, it was a good way of keeping the price down a bit. I looked into it here, but I thought, well, that looks like an interesting thing for our kind of hobbyist market, so I'll do one. And I was helped by, I've forgotten his name, a chap from Cambridge Consultants, Ian Williams. That's right. And he knocked something up based on the calculator chip. While I was looking at that, I was approached by a sales engineer from National Semiconductors who said, why don't you use our 4040 chip, SCAMP as it was known. And he offered to virtually design it. There was an application note that came with it. So I went with that. And I laid out the board, and I have a friend of mine, David Johnson Davis, did a set of programs to go with it, simple programs. They had no storage. We had 256 bytes of memory, so you couldn't do an awful lot. And you had a hex keyboard, which sometimes worked well, but sometimes, if the conductive rubber that we used as the contacting mechanism was high resistance, it didn't work well. So we had some interesting customer observations on the keyboard and what we might do. It changed eventually. But
this was the MK14.
MK14.
Yes.
And MK14, it's not Mark 14, it stands for Microprocessor Kit with 14 components. That's how inventive we were with names, but everybody thought it was Mark 14.
Yes, I don't know if you remember, but you gave me one of the earlier MK14 kits. The keyboard never worked.
No, well, there you are. You've got one of the high resistance sheets of rubber. Sorry about that.
But how successful was the MK14?
That was
as
brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We sold 90,000 of them, which was, seriously high. It was the, and what did we get? Sold them for £39. I can't remember if it was 19 and 6 or 95p. I don't know whether it's pre-decimal or not by then. But and that was the one that kept me in the office over Christmas, because sometimes we were late delivering, and Christmas presents, when they don't arrive, that's pretty serious. And I'm afraid they were often late. But lots of people, they built it and something didn't work and they wanted to know why. Christmas Day in the afternoon, they'd assembled it and wanted to know. I sat in the office answering these questions all through the Christmas holiday, I think 2 years running actually. And you get to know your customers, and it was actually really rather nice. There were some savage ones, there were some very understanding ones. But what happened was that most of them started sending me back things they'd done with it, ideas they'd got, little programs. And if you can use your customer base to build the product.
Well, at this time you were marketing chiefly to hobbyists, I suppose.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
Had the idea that the microcomputer, the personal computer, would become so important occurred to any of you at that time?
Well, in a way, no, because you will see what happened much later. We hadn't really spotted the business computing aspect of it for some years. We saw it as a thing to learn to program with, and clearly programming machine code was jolly useful starting block, but without BASIC or some higher level language, it wasn't really going to get to a wider non-mathematical audience. No, it was just the next step for the hobbyists that liked soldering things together. They'd been buying amplifiers from us to start with. Now they bought MK14s. It wasn't really a computing market, it was a exploration market, electronics market.
And you were very much in the, if you like, in the hands of the semiconductor manufacturers.
Well, the problems of that really came a bit later. Memory chips were always hard to get, and when we got into beyond Science of Cambridge, the ordering of memory, which became a national, globally scarce commodity, up and down like that, you had to order a year ahead, and you'd have to guess your requirements and order a year ahead, which was a tricky thing to do. Chips of all sorts. There were, there is a section that before I start to talk about the problems that we faced in the early Acorn days of chips. We didn't have a lot of problems with the MK14. The numbers were well within the supply of bits and pieces that were available at reasonably short delivery time. We had to make many more than we expected to make because of demand. But within a short space of time, the customers that had bought things from us and had come back with ideas and suggestions had also created a demand by people that had applications that needed microprocessors built in them. And this led to an approach from a company that made fruit machines, one-armed bandits, coming to us and saying, we want to leapfrog the competition and build a microprocessor-controlled fruit machine. This is a fairly hairy industry, the fruit machine industry, with turf wars and some savage attitudes. So
that was pretty advanced thinking for that industry.
It is. But somebody had done it in America, and they were all worried that this American company might come over and flatten them all. So we started doing that, and in order to do that, Science of Cambridge kept on its normal business of selling products to them, and we set up a little consultancy on the side called Cambridge Processor Unit, which handled special builds for people. And that's the time when Herman appeared on the scene.
Herman Hausen.
Yeah, and we we had a collection of part-time employees, mostly from the computer lab, but not all, that helped develop these custom builds. And the first custom build that actually earned the money that started up Cambridge Process Unit was this twin processor heart for a gaming machine. One processor switched all the lights and flashing bits and buttons and things, and the other one did the calculations and controlled the this sounds disgraceful, but it controlled the wheel where it stopped. All the original wheels whizzed round until it ran out of momentum and clicked to a halt. Fairly random. But what we were doing is actually putting a thing in and stopping them, using a random period generator to stop them, but it could be stopped wherever you wanted. So you could absolutely fix it. This was very good because in the old days they used to test the machines by having teams of women testing them for 7 or 8 days on one machine, 24 hours a day. They had to discover what the likelihoods were, and then writing that machine down as being good on this, bad on that, and they'd have to adjust off by changing the number of nudges you were allowed.
Oh yes.
But with the new one, the nudges didn't matter. You could set it and it would do what you wanted. It was still done within the rules because of the so-called random number generator in it. But as we all know, there is no such thing. But that was good fun, and it was good fun because for the chap that did most of the design, Steve Ferber, it involved joining 2 separate microprocessors at bus level, which was quite relatively unusual anyway then.
How did you meet Hermann Hauser?
Hermann in occasionally in bars. I mean, we would. I spent quite a lot of time in bars. Hermann spent a bit less time, but we got talking, and he was interested in what I did, so he came up to Science of Cambridge. We were right opposite King's College in King's Parade, and he was instrumental in making the links with some of the people at the computer lab and the engineering lab, who acted as our part-time employees.
So at this time there was Cambridge Processor Unit, which was your company with Hermann.
Yeah.
Did Science of Cambridge still exist at that?
Science of Cambridge still existed, but at the time when and CPU was there just to do external developments projects. It wasn't really anything to do with Science of Cambridge, but Science of Cambridge, by this time, Clive had seen that that a microprocessor or a microcomputer definitely had consumer appeal. He was by no means keen on it when I first did it, by the way. But then he saw it had, and so he started development of his own. He'd started development of it, but it got taken away as a necessary expense by the NEB.
This would have been around 1978, 76,
yeah,
78.
it got taken away to Newbury Electronics, and became what he'd started became the New Brain.
How did that work? I mean, the
Newbury was already owned by the
Yes.
NEB.
Right.
So when the BBC, maybe I'm getting timings a little bit out here, but when the BBC started looking for something, they decided this is educational
Yes.
and something that we should be doing.
Yes.
They asked the DTI what they should do about it. The DTI said, "Oh, let's see. The NEB's got a company in Oxford, Newbury, rather. Go and see them." So the original BBC platform was going to be based on the New Brain, which was also very galling for Clive because it had started out life in Sinclair.
So the New Brain was originally a Sinclair design.
It wasn't fully, by any means, fully designed. It developed quite a lot more at Newbury, but it was a project that was taken out by the NEB. But Clive had started anyway doing something with 9 tiles to build the original, the first ZX product as
Right.
well.
Mm.
But the new brain had its origins in Sinclair, but that developed as a result of the success of the MK14.
Right. Okay. So, tell me the story of the BBC and the development of the BBC Micro.
At Cambridge Processor Unit, we had a policy of building to order and really aiming at the industrial market.
Mm.
So we were building things to control Skinner boxes in places, and our customers were mostly engineering companies that needed things, not consumers. And I felt a bit sorry that, I felt that we were missing out, and that we needed to have a brand suitable for the consumer market. And so after CPU had been running for about a year, and Science of Cambridge had more or less been shut down by Clive, Acorn was formed as a company, and the product that was largely developed in my house sinking into the Fens was called the Atom, which used the basic designs of the modular card system that we did for the industrial market in a single board computer. But we built into it a local area network as well. We had to, because it's the way things were developed in our offices, with the thing that we call the Econet, which was developed for internal purposes, but actually became enormously important and a big consideration when we came to meeting the BBC. So the Atom was designed in 2 ways. One, Steve Ferber, because he was a specialist on twin processor systems, designed the Atom was designed so that it could plug into a second processor if you wanted to go 16-bit.
The main processor on the Atom was 8-bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
so 6502, same
Yes,
as the Apple.
6502.
But the version that could take twin processors was called the Proton. Had to be, didn't it? And we were really only toying with the idea of the Proton when I saw this advertisement or news item, might have been something you'd written, I don't know, but, about the BBC planning a computer program. And I got in touch. First of all, I rang Clive. Remember, at this time we'd sort of gone apart a bit, but I thought it was worth ringing him and said, "Are you doing something with the BBC?" "No, what are you talking about?" We realised that neither of us knew anything about it. I wasn't quite sure whether he was telling me the truth, but he was. I investigated, and I went to see them, and went to see them with a rough outline of what we were doing, and we could tell them that we had a if you wanted to work with a 16-bit processor, then we had the option to plug one in. If you wanted to run a properly structured BASIC, it was there, but it also had, as the BBC Micro did have, so did the Atom, had BASIC and machine code, which you could mix. So so the BBC sort of faltered. We made a bit of a complaint to the DTI, I think it was at the time, that the BBC shouldn't be doing this sort of thing, and it's not fair, anti-competitive. Didn't suit us. And after 2 or 3 meetings, and they came to see the prototype of the Proton, which worked at the very last minute. And I think Herman has got one of his well-rehearsed stories about snipping a wire that was causing an earth loop.
So I believe.
It worked, and we explained how the Ethernet worked, how they could be linked up. We showed them the atoms linked in a classroom, and this is quite unusual. You could have a teacher, and you could put it in. You could switch remote and the number of the pupil's machine. You could take over the keyboard, and you could write to the screen. This is something you can't do with modern local area networks, but it was especially impressive to the BBC. Anyway, they said, right,
yes,
we'll think about this. We'll probably work with you if you can build this in time.
What was the US competition like at this time?
Well, it was only Apple, really. I mean, there was Atari and Apple, but Atari was really sold as a games machine.
Yes.
It didn't suit the BBC's image at all. It wouldn't have worked. Apple was a clean-cut kid of a product, and it was very similar in design to the BBC machine, but it didn't have the things that the BBC wanted. We built in, because the BBC was promoting this thing called teletext. We built teletext into it, so it had a teletext graphics generator, especially to appeal to them. We didn't really use it as much as we should, but it was there. So it ticked every box they could think of.
How did you go about, I mean, to develop and market this machine, you had to move into software in a big way. How did you do that?
Do you know, the extraordinary thing is at that time, we had sort of full-time about 6 software people, coders, but you know, one of them was a man that was nocturnal, worked all night and all day, and wrote code that worked first time, and wrote code at 3 times the rate of anybody else. Huge. He was the most hugely important generator of product in the soft side. Very, very important at that time, and still is, of course. Even now he's at ARM or something. But because of that, we got a lot done. But we didn't. That wouldn't have stopped us, because by that time, a lot of our market was amongst the Cambridge people. So we had the engineering labs and the computer lab and the maths lab. They all had people that wanted to do things for us. And they were all students or postgrads that liked a bit of a few quid on the side to do something. We had a version for the Atom of VisiCalc, which we called AtomCalc, knocked up by Jack Lang of Raspberry Pi. He knocked it up in about a fortnight, and to have VisiCalc, or AtomCalc as we called it, on the Atom was quite a feather in the cap. But we still didn't really think of business machines, of machines for business, and that's one of our serious failings.
What did the BBC think it was doing with personal computers or microcomputers?
It was teaching programming.
Teaching programming.
Programming, and rather than teaching use of computers. And I think we all felt that. We thought, well, one thing will lead to another, but it didn't. IT was a separate business from learning how to program. And I suppose that's where our nemesis in the shape of IBM appeared. I mean, the first problem that awakened us to it was the frightful Amstrad machine with its built-in printer that we had no answer for. You know, it was just a word processor. But suddenly the market woofed off into, oh yes, I can get that for my wife. She runs a shop. She'd like a word processor. And
let's just step back a bit. There was this quite well publicised spat between yourselves and Sinclair over the BBC Micro. Can you tell us about that?
Clive resented very strongly, and I don't blame him. I would have been just as cross when the BBC announced that they were going with us. And when the DTI added their support to it, they were obliged to add. You could get 50% off with a DTI grant if you're a school, if you bought a BBC computer, or a Sinclair one. Well, the Sinclair one cost less than half as much, so the schools all said, well, we get 300 quid in this one and only 120 quid that, so we'll buy the other one. So it didn't work very well for Clive, the Micros in School scheme. So he was pretty cross about it. But we had the disadvantage that for the new people coming in, they were still buying the cheapest model and the one with the flashiest advertising, which Clive was very good at. So we were missing out badly on the low-cost market. And I was determined that we should have a cut-down BBC computer that ran all the software but didn't have some of the features, and that was called the Electron. The Electron we were going to make as cheaply as we possibly could so we could sell it at the same sort of price as a Sinclair product. And in order to make it cheap, we needed to put a colossal ULA in it to use take up nearly all the general logic componentry, reduce the printed circuit board size and everything. So this
Sorry, ULA.
Uncommitted logic array. This was Ferranti. Ferranti was a connection that I'd had from the Sinclair days because they made a radio chip for us. And we knew the people at Gem Mill that did all the chip development, and they came up with the idea of having uncommitted logic arrays before anybody else. But their technology was based on ECL, high current, rather high, things got hot. There was no CMOS equivalent in those days. So anyway, we worked with them. There was a ULA in the BBC computer, and then there was a much bigger one in the Electron. And the Electron ULA, Ferranti had so many problems that we lost a year and a half, and we missed a vital marketplace. And while we were in the middle of missing the vital marketplace, Sinclair was getting all business that people like W.H. Smith had booked with us. We couldn't deliver, and so we were doing anything we could to keep the pressure up. And I must admit I'm slightly shamefaced. I agreed, we never did knocking copy normally, but we agreed to publish an ad that listed the failure rates of the popular machines.
Oh yes.
It was from Which magazine. It was only just a little bit in it that said these are the Which figures, and it had failure rates of the BBC computer at 1.1 or something, some others, and then Sinclair at 26%. It was a shabby trick, I suppose, but we had to do it. This is what really killed us, you know, the Electron not coming out on time, because something else happened after that. So I agreed to run this ad, and Clive saw it, and he was very cross. So he bumped into me and a little scuffle occurred, but that was a minor thing. It was made a lot of, but it wasn't much.
Well, because this interview is for history, I mean, people may well have watched the BBC microdrama Micromen. What did you think of that?
I found it very embarrassing and uncomfortable. It set out really to make a fool of Clive, and partly a fool of me, as being the two buffoons that ruined the British computer industry. Both are unfair, but I had some say in modifying it. Clive refused to have anything to do with it. I had it modified a bit to get some of the really unfair stuff about Clive taken out. But I'm afraid it exists. I don't like it, but you know, we deserve it, I suppose.
I don't know. I thought it was a bit like a comic.
Yeah.
The Alexander Armstrong with the dreadful bald wig
The
representing
domed
Sinclair.
head, yes, I know. He got some of the shouts right. I mean, we told him the rantings off stage were quite good. They sounded just like Clive, in fact. But I mean, for the little scuffle that happened was, we were both fairly pissed. It was Christmas Eve or something like that, and it was a minor fracas. We were great friends, although we were sort of rivals in business by then. We still remain great friends. Yeah, but if the Electron had come out that Christmas on time, then 500,000 electrons would have been sold, and the world would have been a different place, because it was that gave time for the Amstrad business machine, if you like, to appear on the scene and skew the market completely, and that gave time for the IBM juggernaut to roll inexorably on. The ULA delay was terrible. Kenneth Baker carpeted us both because it was part of the micros in school scheme. But there was no way around it by then. We were totally dependent upon that whacking great ULA being done. So eventually it happened.
What was the problem with the ULA?
It overheated. They'd never built such a big one, and it overheated. It had some other. When it overheats, it gets leakages and things like that, and parts of the circuit wouldn't work properly.
So was the Electron ever a successful machine? I mean, in terms of working, as opposed to selling?
Oh yes. Eventually, the ULA worked, but it only worked by being chosen, picked, tested. So it became very expensive for Ferranti because they got about 40% yield, which was terrible. And the Electron had lost its opportunity. Great pity, because we had a whole series of modules that stuck on the back that did all sorts of things, more than the Beeb would ever have done. But it didn't happen.
The BBC Micro was launched around 1980, and by 1981 you'd shipped 12,000, and 82 you'd shipped 25,000. So it must have been hugely successful for the company.
I thought it was more than that, because I thought we'd certainly did 1 million by, I thought, in three years. So we must have gone up fairly quickly from that. But your figures are probably...
I'm just looking at some of the published figures.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. I thought we were doing higher volumes than that. We started off building in Hong Kong with Wong's, but we wanted to say, and I had this big thing about made in England. We had them being built in Wales and in ICL factory in the Midlands somewhere. I can't remember where it was. So we had 3 different plants building them, and then the problems came of DRAM shortages, which suddenly, when the demand appeared that the chip makers weren't expecting, DRAM became the problem. And our salespeople, BBC originally was going to be sold mail order only, but we got so much pressure from the retailers to stock it that we had to find a way of putting a margin in for retail and a margin in for the BBC. So it got a bit less profitable. But the volumes that went through retailers became dominant. When we didn't deliver on time, not only did they cancel orders, but they demanded price compensation if they had surplus stocks and had to sell them off in a sale, and they demanded price compensation anyway. So one day we had, as in the film, we had a huge number of electrons in our warehouse, And one of the salespeople came to me and said, we've got an interesting inquiry from Russia they want to buy 100,000 electrons. This is, we're still Cold War-ish now. And I said, yeah, how are they going to pay, you know, like, rubles? Anyway, we had a meeting with these people that claimed to represent a Russian state organization. And they said, well, we will buy 60,000 over the next 3 months, and we'll buy the first 1,000 now, and we'll but we want to pay just, we're selling them at 70 quid to retail. I think it was 70, might have been 80, and they wanted to buy them for 40. I think they cost us about 38 to build. And oh dear, but when we thought, look at the stock we'll get rid of, we sort of said, yes, well, perhaps we will. They are only going to be sold in the Soviet Union. All right, if they're only going to be sold in the Soviet Union, or supplied through the state, yes, so it doesn't have a visible going into schools, that's something we can do. We'll have to think about it. We'll think about it and get back to you. And they said, well, look, this is to show our determination. And they put a £500,000 bank draft on the table. Now, if we'd have been a bit wiser, we'd have known how dangerous that was. But we weren't. We were very trusting. So I said, well, you don't have to do that. We don't want it. We're not going to put it in the bank. It's there anyway. Leave it there. We'll see you. We'll wait to hear what you have to say tomorrow or the next day. And they walked away. Then, the next morning, all hell broke loose. All of our customers had been contacted by them to buy electrons at 65 quid each, instead of the 79 to 99 that they were paying, by these people who weren't Russians at all. They were specialists in, you know, stretched and overstocked organized. Mostly they did carpets and jeans, but they'd turned there, they'd gone technical, and they did it to us. And when we said, right, we're not, forget it, we're not dealing with you, they said, oh yes, you've accepted our bank draft, you have legally accepted it. We said, we didn't. And then we said, our internal lawyer was sitting at the table, and he will confirm that we didn't accept it. And when they heard that, they were clever people, they were experienced. Right, so you had a lawyer present, and he didn't explain that he was a lawyer. That's apparently an absolutely wicked thing to do, and you get expelled from the Law Society if you don't explain that you are. Anyway, when he heard that threat, he said, well, I'm resigning. So he resigned. We didn't have any legal witness, and we had to come to terms and pay these people their loss of profits. This was happening at the same time as we were dealing with Olivetti, the first discussion with Olivetti, for Olivetti to sell the product outside into Europe, or where they sold their typewriters in those days. So the Olivetti deal and this were going on at the same time. We were dealing in the phone coming in from these Russian solicitors, and it was one of the most hairy moments of all time. And they threatened us. They said, we know where your directors live. They reeled off the addresses. If you don't, then 20 articulated lorries arrived at our storage depot at Corby, demanding to be let in, all on piecework. 20 angry lorry drivers, and our poor little man that ran the depot was under threat. We had to try and get the police to get them to go away. It was all happening while we were trying to close this deal with Olivetti. We ended up having to pay them £120,000 which we really didn't have at the time.
Mm.
Doesn't sound a lot in today's money, but
Mm.
it was then. So
It's an extraordinary story.
that was, I went to bed with a shotgun by my bed. Others went on holiday, left home. And it was the threats were taken very seriously.
These were threats of physical violence.
Yes.
Gracious. Mm.
Anyway, that was a little high point, more low point. It was high anxiety.
Yes, well, returning to sort of more mundane things like an 11 million loss in 1984.
Yes.
This was presumably part of that. What, I mean, could you enumerate the factors which led to the problems?
I
mean,
think
we've talked about IBM coming in, Amstrad coming in.
yeah, sales were going down and deliveries weren't being made. I mean, the loss of the Electron deliveries at that time were key factors because we had, again, a sign of our naivety even by that time, was that we placed orders with subcontractors which made us absolutely liable to take them. And we accepted orders from retailers like W.H. Smith, Boots, Currys, Dixons, that they retained the ability to cancel without any comeback. So everything was coming at us, and we couldn't push it through. So the loss, I mean, if the loss was largely that the value of the stock was devalued as unsellable. And we were running at the same time an operation in the States to convert to sell BBC computers. We thought was a really good idea. Apple used to sell via reps, agents that travelled across the place selling. And Apple had just got rid of all their reps, closed the repping operation down, and we thought, oh well, why don't we use them? They'll know all the places to go. They have got no constraints on them selling a different product. They'll be very eager to do it. They'll be. So we did a deal with the Apple reps. Only trouble is, after their experience with Apple, they all wanted retainers. And we had to agree to them, some retainers. So we've sent about 300 Apple reps with retainers, which cost money. And then found that FCC, the Americans' main mechanism for stopping imports when they want to, said that we failed RFI emissions tests. I don't think we did any. I mean, our circuits were very similar to Apple's. The contents were the same as Apple. Apple didn't have anything. We had to rebuild the entire internals in a steel case to pass FCC. And that stopped us from selling in the States for almost a year.
Do you think that was deliberate?
What, the FCC was?
Yes.
Oh yes, I mean, it's well known. I mean, and just look around the States for the corpses of British companies that have tried to get in there. But no, FCC is a way of. But it wasn't just that caused the problems in the States. We had a. No, let me backtrack on that a bit. With the delay in rebuilding it, oh yes, we'd also, in order to launch it in the States, we'd done a deal with PSB, Public Service Broadcaster, to run the BBC series.
Oh yes.
And that cost us $200,000. And it's so sad. The numbers seem so puny today, but they were a hell of a lot then. So we were spending money, and we had a development team in California building a Windows-like interface for the next generation. They were all ex-Xerox PARC people. So that, we had our sales people in Boston, the sales reps There was a lot of money going out into America. And I think that, combined with the build-up of stock in the UK and it not getting out in time, I don't know what we could have actually done. We should have had proper contracts, sales agreements with people like WH Smith and Boots. They all cancelled. They said, we don't want any, you know.
I mean, it sounds like your legal people should have been doing a better job.
I think so. Well, we didn't ask them, you know,
Wow.
legal people like, they only do something if you ask them to do something, and we didn't. We were so, up until then, the demand had been so much the dominant thing that we didn't worry about what happened the other way around. And that's, you know, there's a big, serious lesson to be learnt there. Always go. It was largely caused by the long-term delivery of key components like DRAM. But you know, if you didn't order them 2 years in advance, you didn't get them when you wanted them.
Would you also say that you were, in general in the firm, technologists who were inexperienced in business?
Yes. Absolutely. Although some of our sales force were ex-ICL and things like that, but they would have been just salespeople. They wouldn't have been strategists. We didn't do enough on that.
But what was your board like at that time?
There were no well, there was only one. There were two ex, and one chap, a Nedo person, who really had very little influence at all, and one chap called Christopher Ward,
Yes.
who was a journalist, and he was there because he had good journalistic connections, we hoped. But we didn't have, you know, the kind of people that you get onto boards nowadays to provide you with a bit of old-fashioned experience and connections.
Remind me of the structure. Who was chairman, who was managing director?
Herman and I were joint managing directors. We didn't have a chairman until we appointed Alex Reed during the Olivetti deal.
Because he was a very experienced businessman.
Well, he was an architect by training, a helicopter pilot by hobby, and he'd been working for British Telecom in Prestel.
Presto.
So in a funny sort of way, very analytic, very impressive chap, Alex, but experience in the kind of thing that actually hit us, he didn't have either.
Okay.
And Olivetti, that was a disastrous relationship. Olivetti was run by De Benedetti as almost like a dictator at the top.
Let's just remind us of the way that worked. Olivetti first took a share in the company to help with refinancing. Was that right?
Yeah. What happened? First of all, after the loss, and actually quite shortly after the flotation, a year after the flotation, our bankers, who were Lazards, sold all their shares. And this was the largest single block of shares on the market. We only put 10% on the market, remember. That's one of the messages.
So I think we'll have to go back yet another step, and I apologise for that, but the flotation, when was that and why was that?
I was hoping you'd tell me when it was. I think it was 83, wasn't it? Or 84.
Well, 84 was the year of the big loss, the 11 million loss. Presumably
Before
it must
that,
have been at the height of the...
it must have been 82 or something like that. But we were approached by one bank after another wanting to float us. We'd never thought about it. But they said, if you want to, you know, grow to a huge company, you've got to, you know, raise capital and raise your profile and so on. So we were sort of flattered by the attention that we were getting.
Yes.
And eventually it came down to sort of beauty contest, and we chose the two bluest blooded top outfits there were. We chose them out of a number of suitors, and that was Lazards and oh dear, the stockbrokers. I can't remember the stockbrokers' names. They were the top old stockbroking firm. Can't think of the name at the moment, but it was true that after the first year of the flotation, they sold all their shares at double. The price went to double, and they sold, and that sell knocked the share price down colossally, as you would expect.
As it would, yes.
And we complained bitterly about this, and they sort of took no notice. Other people said that that's not what your advisors should ever do. In the end, we told them we were no longer retaining them. So we fired Lazards and the other one, and we went to Close Brothers, rather smaller, less known.
Yes.
And Close Brothers were, their advice to get back on an even keel was to find A, an investment from outside, and B, a sales force. And Olivetti represented both.
Ah.
Olivetti had just sold a big chunk of its equity to AT&T, and so they had a little cash mountain. So putting a bit of money into Acorn that didn't hurt them. And they undertook to put the BBC Computer through all their sales regions, which are considerable worldwide. However, a year after that, they hadn't sold one. And I went to Benedetti, I think Herman as well came, and we said, what's going on? You know, we've still got a big stock of BBC computers that we're expecting you to have sold. And he said, why haven't we sold it? I shall call a meeting. We had a big meeting, a whole room full of people. Olivetti, De Benedetti stood at the top with me and Herman and said, these are our friends from England. We have promised to sell their computer. Why haven't you done it? And with a sort of thump on the table, why haven't we done it? Why have we left our friends down? Very Mussolini-esque, I thought. And there was a long quiet. And then, I want to know. And eventually somebody said, well, sir, if you recall, when we did the deal with AT&T, the deal was that we would manufacture the IBM PC in Ivrea, and that we would sell the IBM PC, and that we would only sell product that was based on MS-DOS. And the BBC Computer isn't based on MS-DOS, so we haven't sold any. So they should never have done the deal that's in the first place. But that was Olivetti's fault, and that was getting towards the last straw as far as our cash flow is concerned. And indeed, Olivetti from then on said, all right, so that's really the end of the relationship. They had an option to take a further major chunk of the equities, to take control, if necessary. They could go up to 80%, which for another £100,000 or something silly, which they didn't want to do because they didn't want to spend any more money on something that wasn't going to be any use to them. And at that point, the BBC Computer supply system looked as if it might come into question. And Kenneth Baker, who I got on very well with, I went to talk to him about it, and he said, well, Olivetti, I think I can help you here. Olivetti have been applying for a license to sell the big AT&T exchange, telephone exchange. Well, that wasn't System X, it was a competition to System X. But they haven't got the license yet. I'm going to tell them that unless they go ahead with the deal with Acorn, they won't get the license. And that's a nice sort of way that politicians can help. Anyway, they did go ahead. They provided a letter to our bank and they paid a little bit more money across. But they didn't like doing it. And so they sent in their insolvency practitioners to try and find a way of valuing the last percentage that they're allowed to get. And they looked at everything and valued it at nothing. Their insolvency practitioners. At this stage, there were all sorts of fallings out. I mean, Alex Reed fell out very badly with the main man from Olivetti. I did. They were just trying to destroy everything we stood for. And then they started shutting down projects, and that's when I decided enough was enough.
Just for the record, Kenneth Baker was Secretary of State for Trade and Industry at that time in the Conservative government.
Yes. Right. Or IT Minister, as you know.
IT Minister, indeed. So, what did you do at that point?
Well, we'd set up an outfit that was called, we'd put in for planning consent for quite a lot of land at the back of where the building was in Cherry Hinton to build what we called a hatchery. It's like an innovation park, fairly small one, but nevertheless, where we could send people that wanted to be part of their own businesses from the company to go and set up. They put a project together, propose it, we'd provide them seed funding, and they'd go and do it as small teams separately in this hatchery. And the only one that had actually started by then, because we hadn't built the hatchery, we got the planning consent, but we hadn't built it, was one called the Communicator, the Acorn Communicator, which was a network computer based on, it was based on BBC hardware, but it had the best modem chip in it you could get at the time, and it was plugged into the phone. It had a phone built into it, a small screen like that or a big screen, and it was meant to be like the one per desk, only rather better. And it had the ability to download big lumps of data via teletext, because actually the bandwidth available from the teletext system was huge and pervasive. It was very much a wasted asset. So it was doing all this, and Olivetti was going to cancel it. So I bought it out of the company, and I put it in a business called GIS.
Yeah.
And that, I think that paid the salaries for the company for a couple of months or something, the amount I paid. And we started to wonder how to build the network computer into something viable, because at the time it was a useful machine without the services that go with it. We'd already set up Redwood Publishing, which was meant to be an electronic publisher, a database acquirer, and then used to supply data from databases to these network computers. The trouble is, it was a bit before its time. There wasn't an internet at that time.
No.
And that made a huge difference. We'd done a deal with Kingston Communication, or Hull Telephone Company, that was one of the forward-looking alternatives to BT, to give us trunk wires.
Yes.
And we'd done a deal with Energys to give us trunk wires on the Energys, optical cables that were slinging under the pylons. And all we had to do was use the local loop, which BT still owned, which was gradually becoming accessible under legislation to get that. But it wasn't Internet Protocol, it was based on ICL's TraderNet. You must remember that. It's a packet switch network. without the IP. And so it seemed that how quickly can we build up databases, and we decided it's going to be too long to do that. What we need is to take this down to the consumer level, and so we shrank the communicator down to something which we called the what did we call it? Keyline terminal. And we set up a team to build the customer base of Keyline. We got all the banks except Barclays, we got all the mail order companies, a lot of food retailers and a few other big retailers, all joined to start letting people, they have a terminal at home, they put in it natural language, I want to go on holiday, or I want to buy my grandmother a present, or who sells thing, or where can I acquire the services of a butler for my party. That was all natural language input. And it would come up with a list from its internal database and say, do you want to talk to them? Then you'd go online to talk to them. Not quite the internet as it is today. It didn't have Google and things like that to back it up, but it was part way there.
So you say that was the forerunner of the internet in many ways?
It wasn't. It's something that would have worked before anybody else was doing it if the internet had been there. But you know, everything happened when the internet appeared, and I suppose we might have been swept aside by bigger organisations. My great sorrow, and this is the biggest regret of all, is that I was unable to maintain the cost of that operation, because my other big fault is that I tended to try and finance everything myself out of not a lot of money that I got from Acorn in the first place. Herman was much better at knowing how to use other people's money, which is why he set up the venture capital fund that has been very successful. He could use a little bit of his own money and then a lot of other people's, and it works because you share the responsibility, you share everything. But I didn't tend to do that. I just thought, oh, I can't be bothered. I can pay for this, and I'll get it earning money quickly. And
were you completely out of Acorn at this time, at the formation of GIS?
I was still a director, but a non-exec and a shareholder.
When did you actually leave Acorn?
It was one of those sort of gradual drifting out processes. I don't think there was ever a specific day, but I mean the day that I bought the communicator was probably the day that I left, and I'm afraid I don't know the date that I left.
We've been talking about Christopher Curry's business activities, and now we're going to talk a little about his early life, his education, and his views on the industry. Christopher, when and where were you born? I
was born in Cambridge in 1946.
You've been a Cambridge man all your life, really?
Indeed, yes.
What did your parents do?
My father worked in farming. My mother didn't do anything. She was a housewife, but most women were in those days.
Right.
Yeah, so there was no technical background at all. Okay. My grandfather was an architect. So again, no reason why I should have moved in this direction.
But at school you did well in science and technology.
Well, I started off well. I used to have the green button, and then came first until I met the boys that joined the school on scholarships, and I couldn't understand why I suddenly started coming 9th instead of first. So I had to come to terms with the fact that they were clever.
So you were at Cedar House School as your primary kindergarten?
Kindergarten and transition, it was called, at Cedar House. It was a girls' school, and it had mixed kindergarten and transition. And the last 2 years there, I was the only boy in a class full of girls, which was, I was too young to take any benefit from that.
So you were at Kimbolton School, And then again, Kimbolton School, where you did your
Yeah,
L's and
Kimbolton.
A-levels.
Went into the prep department at Kimbolton,
Mm.
and then did 3 years in the upper sixth because I had to do a retake on my A-levels because I didn't do very well the first time. Ended up with maths, physics, and further maths, and was going to go to Southampton University.
Yes.
But changed my mind. Other people were recommending things where you could actually start working earlier instead of being poverty-stricken for the next 3 years at university, or 2. So elected to go on what was called a DIT Tech course. But apart from giving up on the Southampton University to read maths, I had always been fascinated by the computing and the words automation. On the way to London, there was a big blue sign that said Elliott Automation.
Yes.
And every time I went past that sign, it sort of, it's a flash of excitement. I didn't know what it meant, but I always wanted to do something to do with the automation. Irrational, but that's a fact. I'll never forget it.
This would have been at a time when, well, computers would have existed, but only as mainframe.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I mean, the only thing I was doing in those days as sort of in electronics was we used to build amplifiers and radios out of old valves that we took out of televisions at the dump. Just go to the dump, and there were always a few televisions there. And if you've got a nice big K66, you could build a guitar amplifier. And there were lots of people with skiffle groups around in those days. We built them amplifiers out of bits out of televisions. That was good fun. Bit dangerous. I had some big shocks from the high voltages on them.
But you survived to tell.
Yeah, survived. But that was sort of where I started taking a more practical interest in electronics, crude though it was. So at the same time, I used to buy things from places like Henry's Radio and build kits, radio kits. But then, in order to proceed in my so-called career, I went to work at Pi, got a job at Pi to do a student apprenticeship, which was interesting because it simply you have to start at the very bottom. And so we started off in solder school, and in where you learn to solder. So Pi was a very impressive place in those days, building radio communication, mobile radio communication for the world. And I worked in the factory there, doing my student apprenticeship, learning to solder, and then learning to do electrical testing. But it wasn't a very intellectually stimulating experience. So I applied for another job and ended up moving to the Royal Radar establishment in Malvern, where I was a lab technician, and learned to do all sorts of things there because we had to build high vacuum equipment, so I had to braze pipes, I had to build power supplies to test circuits, build circuits. We did everything, and it was a hugely valuable practical learning experience there. And what's more, we were in the middle of the most concentrated collection of brilliant people you could find in the country. There were so many original inventor designers at the Royal Radar establishment then. They were like gods who occasionally passed them in the corridors and things. But as far as the work there was concerned, I was working in superconductivity, which was a fairly exciting thing to do, and we were building very, very simple junctions where you put 2 bits of aluminium with an insulating layer across each other, took it down to minus 270 something degrees, and you could use a little aluminium track, a few angstrom units thick, to switch off the current in a 10 amp current in the other track going across at right angles, which seemed pretty impressive to me. I had to polish the glass to make it shiny enough to evaporate the aluminium, polish that, and make the connections, build all the kit. Somebody else was telling me what they wanted to be done, but you got everything you wanted from the stores. They had everything in the stores there. In the lab next door, they had building next door, K block. They had nose cones from TSR2, which wonderful, sleek, pointed things, chock-a-block with the best radar systems the world had ever done, ready to do Cold War missions across under the radar and drop standoff bombs on Moscow, and they never did, luckily. But the plane, the most fabulous looking plane I've ever seen, even made Concorde look lumpy, was cancelled, unfortunately, by a certain group of political activists. But there they were, before my very eyes, these wonderful nose cones.
Looking back over your career, are there people you can point to who've been a particular influence, particular mentors?
Well, if I just look at the people at Malvern, there's a man called Baxendale who created the classic tone control circuits that every system, until signal processors came along, still use. There's a man called Dinsdale who invented push-pull transistor amplifiers, and they were people important to me because I built those things, and I built them. And then before I worked at Malvern, and when I got to Malvern and found them there, it was a very odd experience to be amongst the people that whose names were still applied to the technologies. But I got a bit more used to it later, because my time at Malvern was a bit cut short by a few indiscretions on my part, and I left on a brief spell working in a place in St Neots called W.R. Grace, before I saw an advertisement for Sinclair Radionics. You're going to which I applied for, and he offered us the job on the spot, joining Clive Sinclair in his new premises in Cambridge.
What sort of influence did Clive Sinclair have on you, do you think?
Interest in me?
No,
what was Clive doing?
No, I mean, how did he influence you? I mean, was he a mentor?
Absolutely. I mean, Clive was a can-do person with, as so many articles used to put it, no formal education. Really rather insulting. I mean, like me, he hadn't been to university. But he was an inventor. He had an amazing determination to get things done, and he would use first principles because he wasn't a professionally trained electronics engineer. He just worked from first principles. So he built televisions with circuits that weren't based on existing circuits at all. Anything that he wanted to do, he thought, well, let's try doing this. And 9 times out of 10, they'd work to a degree. So A, he was a can-do person. B, he sort of invented crowdfunding in a funny sort of way, and this was important to me. I mean, it's all called crowdfunding now, but in those days, mail order was crowdfunding. You stretched the limits a bit. You got your suppliers to give you 30 days, which you always stretched to 60 or 90 days. You sent off, you booked the advertising, which you got 30 or 90 days on. and the checks came in and you cashed them. You could in those days. You cashed them, put them in the bank, and then you might deliver some on time, but you had, please allow 28 days for delivery. I know nowadays it doesn't look, it's very uncommon, that sort of thing, but in those days 28 days was quite normal, and it was legal to cash the checks in advance. Things had changed. But that was crowdfunding, and only if you got customers from the community, that was crowdfunding. And actually some of the modern crowdfunding techniques are no different, really. So he taught me how to do that and how to get the timing right to get your product built, probably the design completed and built within the 28 or 54, 56 days that it might take to deliver, and at the same time learn how to handle the customers that weren't happy. So the can-do bit about Clive was terribly important. The determination and the way he drove us like a slave driver, but we didn't mind. We worked often till 8 o'clock every night and didn't mind at all. It was such fun. It was always a new product and always a new challenge. So that was a really good 12 years of my life. And in that time, you know, I got more and more like Clive's friend than his employee, but the relationship didn't change. I suppose watched him go up to the stratosphere and then down again. The huge success of the first calculator.
Yes.
And it was all, I mean, we more or less created the whole concept of hi-fi systems as well. Sinclair Hi-Fi was the dominant sound system. There were higher quality, higher cost people like Quad and others, but we did the snazzy stuff. He loved sharp design, and his name in that famous sort of zigzaggy thing was on everything. So he was a very, very strong influence. I might have learnt some of the bad habits as well as the good ones, but...
What in your career have you been most proud of?
Well, I was very proud of the Sinclair executive, because that was my my project from beginning to end, from picking the chips up in the States to fitting everything inside the ludicrously small case that we had to fit it into, laying out the printed circuit board, the lot. So when it came out, it looked good. It even worked reasonably well, and that was very pleasing indeed. But I think after that, the next product I was very proud of, and I use the word proud carefully, because I don't think I'm often proud of anything, but maybe I haven't done anything worth being proud of. But the MK14 was on its own out in the first of its kind, and it was very pleasing to see it sell so many so quickly. And that was what I realised was, you know, there's a existing market. If you can give that existing market something which takes it into a slightly different area, then you've created another market. And it's about finding the inherent enthusiasms and interests and catering for them. So computing, or microprocessing as we called it in those days, was really, as far as I'm concerned, built out of the soldering iron enthusiast market, who built amplifiers and things before that.
Surely you're proud of the BBC Micro.
Well, of course, the BBC Micro was a hugely team-based project, and it was a accumulation of important features that came from a lot of different areas. The BBC had seen its predecessor, the Atom, and had decided that it really wasn't going to do the job that they wanted. But because of the other things that we had in train, you know, like the twin processor system, like the networking, like the structured, we were able to adapt the basic interpreter to exactly what they wanted. Like the fact that it had assembly code programming built into it. It did so many of the things that the BBC wanted. They had no real choice to make. What they had in their sights originally, being the new brain, was A, untested, incomplete, and B, had a lot of the shortcomings that the Atom had. It was also Z80 based, and we were in the 6502 camp, so yes, I'm proud of that, but I would say that I'm more proud of the fact that I made the effort to have a go at the BBC and try and stop them from going ahead with the new brain. The rest of it, the rest of the design, was a team thing. There were some very important players in that.
What do you think your biggest mistakes have been? What do you most regret?
I think I've sort of said this before. What I've regretted since then, I've regretted not having more orthodox management controls over the processes of ordering and taking bookings from people, because that really did hurt Acorn. The fact that we were caught between suppliers that wouldn't shut off the supply and buyers that could just shut off their demand. And the result on cash flow was a critical factor for us. So that could have been avoided. We should have been more careful about that. I am mostly upset about some of the other projects that I should have kept going with, but for financial pressure reasons, I was obliged to abandon them. In particular, the tele-shopping project, which really would have been the most important presage of the tele-shopping that exists now with the internet. It was pre-internet, but it was used in exactly the same way. You had a series of suppliers that were very keen to supply via a keyboard. The keyboard, the model for Keyline was that people would buy a terminal at a reduced price of £50, a deposit in fact that they could have back if they wanted to give it back, and then they paid. We got a commission on every sale that the retailers made. So it was a model that hadn't really existed before as well. It's the mobile phone model to some degree. I'm really really very disappointed that I didn't continue with that, because we'd have been there very early, and it's important to be there early in some of these big growth markets.
And the reason this failed was at least to do with the ERM and Britain's involvement in the ERM.
Well, the point was that, again, I'd been a little bit silly in trying to finance it myself for a long time, and my own funds were limited, as Acorn shares had diminished in almost a penny share value at one time. I should have got more people involved, and I did have a venture capital company involved, which was in the process of raising about £1 million. Not a lot even in those days, but there was delay after delay after delay, and the reason for the delay was John Major's attempts to keep Britain in the European exchange rate mechanism, keep the value of the pound within the currency snake, and some certain nasty people over the other side of the Atlantic who are determined to make money out of forcing it by buying and selling and so on, the currency. So the result was that every time the pound slipped to the bottom of the snake, John Major decided to put the interest rates up to lift it off the bottom. And within the period of about a year, interest rates had gone up to officially to 15–16% banks, which meant a lot of people being charged 20 to 25%, which under any circumstances is unsustainable. And as a result of that, venture capital, which used to work on a 10% expectation of increase in value, could earn much more than 10% just putting it in the bank. And most of their investment companies that had a combination of venture capital and bank loans were being crucified by the interest on the bank loans. It was very bad news for venture capital at the time. It was a much newer market then, younger market than venture capital. But they all closed down. One after another, they closed down. Our venture capital company gave up just before Black Wednesday. And when that happened, as you know, it took about 3 months for things to get back to normal. But it was too late for me. That meant that I had to take up, I became responsible for the debts of the company, and it more or less took me, well, it took me very largely into personal bankruptcy. And I wasn't alone during that ERM fiasco that people should be thinking about now with the referendum coming up. There were more suicides, bankruptcies, divorces, and insolvencies in that period than any other equivalent period in recorded history. So he's got a lot to answer for, Mr. Major, in my book.
Do you think if you'd had better business advice, you know, in terms of finding money, borrowing money, rather than using your own money, you would have? I should have at all times. The trouble is, some of the things I was trying to do were not really tested ideas, and it's quite difficult. It's quite a long process of convincing people. The world is different now. There is a lot more open attitude to, and a lot more choices for venture capital supply. I mean, I think I would have rather liked the official form of crowdfunding today for some of these things, but yes, I needed to have more people alongside me with the same interest of making their investment work, rather than mostly depending on my own efforts. So more business advice, more sharing of responsibilities would have been helpful. So am I right in thinking that at this point you were, as you say, sort of personally bankrupt?
I had to enter what's called an IVA, personal IVA, which isn't supposed to limit you in any way, but it sort of makes an undertaking that you will pay this amount of money over a period of time. And this was after I'd already lost my house. I used the house, which was a beautiful Georgian house, a ridiculous extravagance. When we first floated, I bought it and enjoyed it for 10 years. But foolishly used it as collateral for the E2S venture, thinking it was a bridging loan, which it was meant to be. But when the venture capital disappeared, it became my responsibility. And they took the property from me for actually far less than I originally paid for it 10 years earlier. which I don't know how they did it. I've always expected to fight back and recover it, but I never did. Actually, what happened after that was almost equivalent to bankruptcy. Because there comes a time when most of your options are closed off, and it was a pretty painful time.
So what have you been doing since then? I mean, you formed GIS.
GIS was formed right when we first saw that Acorn was being subsumed by Olivetti, and they were cancelling all the projects that we were doing there. So GIS did two things early on. One was we were very interested in digital money. After the banks, I thought, treated us abominably, I thought, why on earth do we have banks just to pass money around? We should be doing it ourselves. What's the matter with cash? Or if you can't do it with cash, do it electronically. And we created a thing called a transactor, which had a smart card there, and you transferred value off the smart card. That was very early days, and then that was developed as the payment mechanism for the Keyline terminal as well. And in due course, because we got all the banks involved in it, the banks thought this is really our business, and an organisation called Mondex was created at NatWest Bank, which Midland Bank, all the banks except Barclays joined it. And Mondex was cash stored on a card, which was transferred to another card offline. This is the big difference between most of the digital cash now and then. It was offline, so it was exactly like paying with a coin or a note. And we got very heavily involved in this because it was really based on our original concept. And we became the second biggest supplier to Mondex. We had offices in South Africa, Hong Kong, Australia, Canada, everywhere where there was a Mondex operation. And it was all looking very, very exciting. We built most of the bank head-end systems for the Mondex kit, for all of the banks. But in order to expand, Mondex decided that what do we need to do to get real global coverage? We need to do a deal with somebody who's got real global coverage. And they went to MasterCard. And MasterCard said, yeah, all right, we'll buy 51%. And then, you've got the whole of the MasterCard coverage all over the world. They bought 51% and they closed it down completely 3 months later. We all thought that Hitachi, who lost 400 million on this, and a few of the others, would sue MasterCard. But the Japanese didn't. And that was the second terrible destruction of my dreams and my business technical empire, because we'd built all sorts of devices for handheld consumers, point of sale stuff, everything to go with Mondex. And suddenly it was all dead and buried in just like that. One MasterCard bit of chicanery, because MasterCard makes its money out of every time you send something across a wire. It was against their business model. Should never have let them invest. Right. They lied. They did. So there's another regret. But nothing I could do about it.
No. What have you been doing since then?
Well, I keep going with electronic currencies, and every now and again one comes back from one place or another that looks like an appropriate one. I keep going with smart cards. What I've been trying to do recently is generate a market from the retired population. We all have we all except this chap opposite me has a certain interest in this. But we all know that the economy of the country is in a bit of a mess. We're a one-time manufacturing economy no longer, And we can't afford the expense that we're finding the ageing population is creating. The National Health is always saying it's broke. My view is that the ageing population, just because you've reached retirement age, doesn't mean to say you're no bloody use. And that most people are infuriated when they get accused of being, oh, he's retired, doesn't count any longer. So there's a huge latent set of skills and a huge latent amount of enthusiasm for doing things for themselves and doing things for the community. When you get to a certain age, you start to be a lot more kind to your fellow people. You really, everyone we've met and talked on this, we've had a trial project. It's called Bluefish. As soon as people get to 65, 70, they have a nicer attitude and they really do want to help each other. So I think there's a huge economic entity in the retired population. There are 12.5 million people that carry bus passes around. A bus pass in London is wonderful, but what it is, it's an ID card with a purse on it. So we did a version of that which had a complete medical history on it and a complete set of logging of visits and doing good deeds and so on. I want to build it. If you can get people to take more interest in their health and the health of other people around them, and many of them are very fit and well. I mean, I'm 70 and I'm quite capable of doing things still. They want to do it. People want to do it. There is an economic community just sitting there waiting to be. You don't want to work full time, and you don't want to do something that messes up your pension arrangements. So I have the idea that there is a pseudo-currency outside the tax thing, which is used to incentivize people to do good things for each other, and the whole thing makes people aware of health issues. I'm also developing test and measurement systems for health that you can wear at home. So I'm very interested in wearable Internet of Things sensors. And I think if you can get people to look after themselves, that's how you save money. The problem with this country is, having had a National Health Service as the sort of, the wonderful thing that was created in 1948 or whatever it was, and been used to it so long, we have a dependency culture which isn't actually healthy. There has to be some sort of backstop there, and some of the other countries show that the alternatives are not so good. But the National Health Service is too big, too powerful, too immune to change, and it needs modifying a lot. And the only way to modify it is by people like us start to play an active role. So that's what spend a lot of my time doing at the moment. It's hard work.
And is that just you personally or a company?
It's called Bluefish, and at the moment it's me and a group of other people that are of the same feel the same way, but it's not. We've done a trial of using the bus pass as the sort of membership card key, and at the moment I'm trying to set it up, funded by a social impact bond. I don't know whether
Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well, there's this thing called social impact investment. Social impact investment says that you can make an investment in something that might not give you a profit back in the form of a dividend, but it will, if it can be shown to have a beneficial effect down the line, you will get full tax relief on that investment. And the way it mostly works nowadays is people invest in a building which gets used to house a charity. That's a typical, very poor example of a social impact investment. You've got a charity which is doing good works, it sits in a building built for them with money coming from tax-paying people. But I think that that social impact investment should be a little bit more exciting than that. And social impact, they've got a cabinet office man supposed to be looking after this. It's a quiet but important plank of government policy, and it's cross-party agreement. So it's all about investing in mostly non-for-profits. But my idea is that it's not a not-for-profit. It's what's called a community interest company, which is something which is halfway between a charity and a limited company. And that's called Bluefish, and that's what I'm working on. And as I say, it's a fairly informal grouping at the moment, but it's got everything built into it. It's got e-cash, it's got the latest kinds of health monitoring systems. Yeah, it's got everything. It's got, yeah.
Again, looking back over your career, what advice would you give to young people wanting to make their career in the electronics business, the IT business?
Do you know, I really think that probably any advice I could give would be iffy. I think I can say what I would do, but the world has changed so much. You know, the opportunities for fundraising are extraordinary now. The different varieties of crowdfunding, you can really get businesses started in the most unlikely ways. I think the businesses need to have there has to be a fundamental need or a fundamental appetite for it. It's not just a good idea to build around something that you particularly like yourself. But second guessing what next year's fashion or next year's must-have is partly luck. And I would say that as a piece of advice, try and do it with either do it with other people's money, and that means you get tested fairly carefully before you get it, but don't risk everything on something that you hope is going to make you rich, because it might make you very poor. I think that's rather feeble advice, but I'd love to have some real insights into where the future big money startups are going to be. Clearly there's lots of things happening in health management, and I think the merging of electronics and biology, biotech, is becoming more and more of reality. So there's some really exciting things happening there, and if you happen to be in genetics and big data is another important subject, because you're going to develop inferences from big data that will be better than test results from an individual. I really do think that huge amounts of data will produce very, very important results when they're analysed properly. And if you can, I still worry again about the national health being a block to developments. I do think that mobile phones, the ubiquitous mechanism for things like health fitness management, may be more powerful instruments for change in personal health than any kind of government advice or diktats coming from the NHS via the CCGs, via the GPs. People want to make their own decisions, and they've got to have an active consumer market to do it. So consumer markets in health have got to be a very interesting area to be in.
Fine. I think we've covered the ground pretty well. Christopher Curry, thank you very much.
Thank you.